But if I can demonstrate that I care about the people that I work with, then the hard decisions, it's not necessarily going to make me popular, but they'll be able to put it together in a context and say, well, I believe Dennis cares about me. This had to have been a hard decision to make. And they'll tend to give me benefit of doubt. But you know what? At the end of the day, that really doesn't matter. Because in my definition of humility, it's a posture of submission to God.
Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel Yang, National Director of Churches of Welcome at World Relief, and today we're talking with Dr. Dennis Edwards. Dennis is Associate Professor of New Testament, as well as Vice President for Church Relations and Dean of North Park Seminary in Chicago. He's ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church and has worked in urban ministry for over 3 decades. Today we're talking about his book, Humility Illuminated: The Biblical Path Back to Christian Character. But first, let's go to Ed Stetzer, Editor-in-Chief of Outreach Magazine and the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology.
You're talking to 2 deans today, Daniel Young. That's kind of fun. So 2 seminary leaders. That's sort of interesting. I don't think we've ever had another seminary leader on. And to talk about humility, the jokes, I'm afraid, are going to be many today, because literally we're talking to Dennis R. Edwards, who wrote the book on humility. And this is an old joke with John Dixon. He wrote Humilitas, and I think he spoke at the Global Leadership Network, Global Leadership Summit, on the book. And you cite him in your book. But he, everywhere he goes, he's like, everyone sort of makes that joke. So I know you have stepped into this space, Dennis, and so you got to expect it. But and I'm glad you did, though. I think it's fascinating. In your book, you write, the Church of the United States, and perhaps in other places throughout the world, needs to recover, respect, and reenact biblical humility. We Christians are fractured, but humility will help us heal. So let's start with, how do you define it? Why is it essential for Christians? Why does it matter?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate this opportunity to have a conversation with you. Humility, I define as a posture of submission to God, which works itself out in I will say an embodiment in actions, in a way of being that is peacemaking and reconciling. So those 2 basic movements: submission to God, and then being a peacemaker with others.
Okay, so when you think in terms, because I guess right now we're living in a moment where there's a whole wing of Christians who think the answer to the current cultural moment is not humility. We've had too much humility, too much deference,
right.
and more. And of course, when we go back 2,000 years ago, and you explore this in the book, I mean, humility wasn't even a cultural value. We think of it today like humility, compassion, things that's cultural values, but those were not cultural values 2,000 years ago. Unpack that a little bit for us, because, and maybe in this countercultural moment, going back to 2,000 years ago wouldn't hurt us.
Right. In the world, in the world in which the New Testament emerged, humility was not considered a virtue, as you noted. In fact, even the language of humility that the Apostle Paul uses, that Peter uses, that we see in Matthew's Gospel describing Jesus, that language was used to describe character traits that were not valued at all, that were the kinds of things that would not get you honor in a society based on honor and shame, right? So the idea of willingly submitting yourself to someone else, or putting yourself in a position that, yes, could be deferential, or at least, I'll say at the very least, respectful of somebody who's not of your station, those kinds of actions were not going to advance you in society. And I would say the same is true today. We tend not to pay attention to the people who are around us doing the things that we don't respect. People are cleaning the floors or serving our tables or doing those things. We don't even notice them in our society very much. And humility would be a posture that recognizes others and seeks to build, some sort of concord.
I'm wondering what your perception of humility, how it's changed over years, because oftentimes people think humility as, being a pushover or being soft, or maybe even being unhelpfully weak. So help us think through some of the misconceptions and maybe your own journey of, understanding humility over time.
Yeah, thank you. I do try to talk about that in the book, because I had a mixed bag of views. I mean, I didn't know what humility really was. And, I worked in the Midwest for a while, and in Minnesota, and maybe I shouldn't name the place, but there's sort of a reputation of people being kind and such. But the reality is, Nobody wanted to put themselves in a position of looking like they were stepping forward or taking too much, right? So you would have one last piece of dessert we'd have in the break room at church, and they would not take the last one, but they'd cut it in half and take, half of one. And there's this sense that humility means just not doing anything that would highlight myself in any way. So you had to be deferential, passive, even weak, all those things that you just touched on. But I don't think that's the case when we look at Jesus, or we look at the way humility is described in various places throughout the Bible, as I try to trace in the book. So one quick example would be Jesus, right? Who describes himself as humble in heart and even gentle in Matthew 11, right? Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. But in that same book, you see him later denouncing hypocrisy. Woe to you, teachers of the law, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. You do this, you say this, but you do this other thing. So this powerful persona to denounce injustice and hypocrisy is also the same person who invites all of those who are weighed down. So to me, that's what humility really is. It's not just not taking the last cookie or something. It's really paying attention to those who are hurting in our society and speaking out against the things that are wrong.
Yeah, and I liked that. First of all, having lived in the Midwest, we would have been. We didn't overlap when I was there at Wheaton, but it's a whole different thing. Like the deference to others. And I grew up in New York. I think you lived in Brooklyn. Some, if I remember your
I grew up in New York.
And humility is a cultural value even for New Yorkers, and it looks different. It's not. We don't necessarily cut the last piece of cake and share it,
Right.
but you still have to have that humility. So one of the things I like about that is that, and a lot of times when someone becomes a dean like you, is people forget you had a field. You have a scholarly field. Your New Testament's your scholarly field.
Right.
And so this is a deeply biblical, New Testament particularly rooted book. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So What is Scripture and the example of Jesus described in Scripture? What are some things they teach us about humility?
Yes, thank you. That scriptural work, I tried to go from the Old Testament, move my way into the New Testament, but that focus on Jesus that you just mentioned, I would be to see those two things in my definition. You would see this posture of submission to God the Father. You would see that as being the very reason why Jesus did all that he did. He would say that. That's his mission, right? So that posture of submission to the Father, but then it plays itself out in acts of mercy, acts of justice, acts of reconciliation, that kind of thing. But that's also involves truth telling. So we see it in Matthew's gospel. I highlighted Matthew's gospel because partly because of the vocabulary of humility is pretty strong there. So as I mentioned already, that 11:29 passage. But the basic movement is that you see it in the life of Jesus, you see it in the teachings of Jesus, and then you see it played out in the way some New Testament writers are talking about humility, the thing that helps to bring communities together in those virtue lists that we see, like in Paul or in Peter. I'll say one more thing is that there's a refrain that we see in the Old Testament. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That refrain works itself through the Old Testament. It works itself into the Apocrypha, like a book like Sirach. It works itself into the New Testament, getting quoted or alluded to a few times, and then even works itself into the Apostolic Fathers, who then are showing how humility ought to be a virtue that actually marked and identified Christians in their world.
Dr. Edwards, there's that portion of Scripture where Jesus is talking to his disciples, apostles, about, don't do what the Gentiles do. They lord it over
it's a good
others.
example.
And he, in some ways, he's speaking to church leaders or those who lead the people of God. And what are you observing with the struggles that church leaders have in the area of humility? And then, so that's the first question. And then also talk about, is it possible to have like strong leadership that's still humble?
Yes, to that second question, and I can unpack it later. But for your first question, I mean, it is difficult because there are pressures. Look, it's a societal pressure. We know that to make a mark, or at least we believe and feel that to make a mark in the world, and you can define making a mark however you like, we have to be louder than somebody else. We have to prove ourselves to be better than someone else. So we buy into the same competitive mindset that's operative in the rest of the world. I mean, people will tease me about that notion. I jokingly say, and actually not jokingly, I say people don't like the participation trophy because they think it minimizes the stars, and that we're just coddling everybody. I was one of those kids bused to school in New York. I grew up in the 60s in New York. I got bused to another neighborhood. Took me an hour to get to school when my peers could walk and could, maybe ride their bikes. Just showing up was a feat. So for me, participation trophies say I want to respect the fact that you showed up, even though it could be really challenging for you. So I'm saying pastors are dealing with this notion that just showing up is not good enough. I've got to somehow prove that I'm better than someone else. And then in the social media world, I got to be an influencer now. I've got to somehow show. So I think we have these pressures to say it's not just about the faithfulness that I show to the people that I'm serving. It's I've got to somehow make this mark, and we become as competitive as the ancient Romans, in my view. So that's
Yeah.
the first part of the question, I think.
No, go to the second part. You're going to go to the second part because I think the strong leadership question is because at North Park, or at Wheaton where I was, or Talbot I am. I mean, we're deans, and this is a tumultuous time. We had to make hard decisions. I can assure you that somebody that you had to, say this isn't working, and we're going to need to, let you go, or else be. They don't necessarily see you as humble in that situation. They see you. I mean, that sometimes it's overbearing. So. Because you made hard decisions that impacted them negatively. So how do you humbly lead and make hard decisions as a strong leader?
Well, I would like to think that the hard decisions aren't the only decisions that are made. I mean, there's a bunch of
For sure.
decisions that lead up, and there's a certain posture that one can develop in leadership that, frankly, I think one of the best things we can do as pastors and leaders is to truly lean into that word shepherd. Is that if we care for the flock, this is what Peter would say in 1 Peter 5 as he's talking to the elders. He says, guard the flock. So part of my persona is to be that kind of person that recognizes other people. I've been in plenty of organizations, churches, and other places where people disrespected me, didn't know who I was, didn't care who I was, didn't think I was very bright. So when they make a decision that affects me, it hurts a lot because I think you don't even know what I'm dealing with. But if I can demonstrate that I care about the people that I work with, then the hard decisions, it's not necessarily going to make me popular, but they'll be able to put it together in a context and say, well, I believe Dennis cares about me. This had to have been a hard decision to make. And they'll tend to give me benefit of doubt. But you know what? At the end of the day, that really doesn't matter because in my definition of humility, it's a posture of submission to God. It's going to work itself out in peacemaking. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to understand, but it does mean my hope and my belief is it means they won't be able to accuse me of being overbearing because my way of life is not to be that.
Well, I want to come back to what you're seeing in Jesus and how he modeled humility, how that can be helpful to pastors and church leaders today. Jesus was in a lot of different situations where he was being tested and where, like you were saying, he had to really show up. What do you think church leaders today is missing from Jesus's life when it comes to effective leadership and how to apply humility, when to apply it? Because I think sometimes, depending on your personality and depending on your leadership style, leaders can be very brash or very directive. Where do we see from Jesus where he knew exactly when to apply humility and how to apply it?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I'm struggling a little bit because my part of my thesis is that I don't think humility is something that gets applied.
You
I
think
think
it's more of a characteristic
I
and
think it's a
something that's lived out every day?
characteristic.
Because I was,
It's
even
a
as you're asking that, Daniel, I was
yeah,
like, what are you
yeah,
saying? Because there are times you don't. Help unpack that a little more, Daniel, before Dennis
yeah,
kind of
sure.
goes there, because it sounds strange to me too.
Yeah. So when does a leader know when to show up and as you were saying, uh, apply their strong leadership, and how do they do that in a way that's humble, that's not aggressive, that's not Jesus flipped tables. Is that an act of humility? He knew when sort of to step back and to step up. So I'm wondering, from
Sure,
your
sure.
perspective, how do we make those discernment?
The Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network, which is dedicated to resourcing church leaders in order to help them face the complexities of ministry today. The Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by challenging assumptions, by providing insights, and offering practical advice and solutions and steps that will help church leaders navigate the variety of cultures and contexts that we're serving in. Learn more at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network.
Well, I do like that last phrase where you said when to step back and when to step up. I think that there's something really quite wise about that is consistent with the nature of humility. Yeah, I mean, the turning the tables is actually, that's a great example. I don't actually unpack that one in the book because I feel like it's pretty well known and common. But even in that, when Jesus does it and communicates that it's the zeal for the house of the Lord, that he has um, stepped into a situation that he sees as wrong and unjust and leans right into it. To me, that actually is an act of humility. Humility is my submission to God, and that means I can call out injustice, because calling out injustice means I'm making things right or helping to make things right for the people who are being hurt or overlooked or marginalized. So for me, I lean into that because maybe I should say more clearly, I have a fundamental sense that what humility does, when I talk about being reconciling, is that there's a slant toward those who are marginalized and facing injustice. So for me, humility is about making sure that those folks have a voice. So, and I see Jesus doing that. I see him speaking up on behalf of healing those who are hurt and pushed to the sides in their world. So for me, humility does that, even if it means that my confrontation of injustice is going to ruffle the feathers of people who have power. So it might come off as brash and strong. I think it comes off as godly.
Right, because you're making a decision that might be, a hard decision for an individual to receive, but maybe for the good of the organization, for the good of
Sure,
others, for the
that's
good of
right.
the flourishing of the organization, and for the good of those who might be marginalized, otherwise not heard. So
That's right.
that makes sense. And Daniel, thanks for clarifying that, because I think
Hmm.
it got to a good question. Because again, I think sometimes, and again, and people can get the book is the Humility Illuminated, the biblical path back to Christian character. Because again, I think this is something, and we see it when people really dig deep and try to understand New Testament teaching or biblical teaching about humility. It's not the necessity of constant not making hard decisions. It's not the necessity of not being a good and effective leader. It's a question how you do those things. So talk to us a little bit about how you
Hmm.
have sort of seen in the nitty gritty of leading, maybe even now in your new role at North Park. What are some ways that you're exercising humility in
Yeah.
leadership that might be helpful to pastors and church leaders who are listening?
Yes. Well, I hope it can be helpful. My story has been a bumpy one, so I won't get into all of that. But because I've served in churches where I wasn't part of an ethnic majority, so I've been in churches where African Americans were a small number, and even as a leader in those spaces, that's a whole nother conversation. Because humility, while some people might assume it means passivity and deference, it still means speaking the truth in love, right? So you're still going to ruffle some feathers, and I did. I would say here, but in both cases, in the church and here, it's back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, is that I try to spend my time um, helping people to be seen and be heard and know that they're valued. That's part of leadership in my view. So humility entails listening. I want to know people's stories. I want to know what's important to them. So we did have a tough decision to make it's been about a year and a half ago. And I won't get into the details of it because people will know too much about it. But it involved, whether we would invite a certain person to be on the part of our team here. We had a vacancy, and my colleagues were divided on this. We struggled a bit to know if that if if the people that we were thinking about, I shouldn't even say the person. That's not even the case. It was more than that was the dilemma, right? Of which direction we should go, and I suspended the conversation, the decision, because they saw me as perhaps being a tiebreaker that would come in and just make an edict and say it's got to go this way. And I said no. I said, why would I do that and alienate half the team? I said we've got to find a third way. So I found out there were several people who later, were sighing with relief that I didn't just come in with an act of authority and say, look, it has to be this way. Now, that's a small example of something that, that maybe everyone would have said, hey, let's do that. Let's do the Solomon split the baby thing. I mean, but in some ways, I think their trust was developed because I wasn't trying to push a Dennis agenda as much as I was trying to figure out what's helpful for the whole community. And I think that that's part of what leadership entails.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it goes back to your point about how humility is linked to peacemaking, and and even in that example, reconciling the divided opinions. You write a lot about suffering. Can you talk about like the role suffering plays in being humble?
Yeah, that was a hard chapter because different people will define suffering different ways. And we tend to, I say we now, and I'm defining we as sort of broad American Christianity, maybe. But there's a sense that we think we know how to help somebody when they're suffering. And sometimes we don't. We think we know. So we'll give them a platitude, or we'll give them a Bible verse, or something like that. So I think the first order of business in humility is for the person who's observing the sufferer, right? Is to not assume that we know what that person needs, but to enter in as best we can to help them, simply by being with them and walking alongside and figuring out how we can be helpful rather than assuming it. But there's humility also on the part of the person who is suffering. That's a hard one because it does entail still a submission to God that says, I can't give up God. It's Job-like, right? It's like, I'm not going to give up on God when I'm suffering because God really is my only hope, even though I'm in the midst of this thing and I can't figure out why. So part of that humility, but then there's another piece of that humility that when people are trying to help is that we actually take it, and we're willing to receive the help that people are giving us rather than isolating ourselves, which can also happen when we're suffering and feeling whatever we're feeling. We can pull away rather than lean into some of the relationships that God brings our way. So those are some basics that I see in the scripture and also just in my pastoral years of ministry.
Yeah, that's the part probably that I don't like about your book, is that because I've seen it play out in a lot of situations where one of the ways God brings humility into people's lives is through suffering. And some of the people that I maybe knew in their 20s and the 30s, and then they just hit a wall, or a wall hit them.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
was transformative, and they would embrace that suffering as something that
Yes.
had to turn towards humility in their lives. But can I just say, Dennis Edwards, I don't like that.
Yes,
And
yeah, well, I hear that really well. And so, yeah, I can right now as an older person looking back and saying a lot of what you just said, Ed, is
yeah,
that there's this wisdom, right, that comes from having endured that, but nobody wants to welcome suffering. So I tried to be really gentle in that chapter because I wanted to respect the fact that we all will go through something we'll label suffering, but at the same time, um, it doesn't have to be the end, right? I mean, it can help us to move on to a new beginning.
yeah. And I don't know too many people in ministry who wouldn't at least give lip service to the idea that I would like to be more humble.
Sure.
I don't know why we have that aspirational value, but often that we don't necessarily pursue humility. So if someone is listening and they're like, man, I think that's a good thing. The Bible teaches that's a good thing. I see that in the character of Jesus. And again, they can pick up your book, and Humility Illuminated, the Biblical Path Back to Christian Character, to learn more. But so here's what I would swing around to. So if I believe this is important, what are some things that our listeners, our average pastors, church leaders can do to start cultivating humility in their own lives?
Yes. Well, one thing is I may come off being less. People might not like everything I'm going to say because part of it is I think we need to reject on some level what we think is what our jobs are supposed to look like, because we've taken our cues from certain high profile people. So for part of that is to ask myself, who do I think I'm trying to be like, or what do I think I'm trying to be like, or do I really think do I really think it's about developing a platform? Is that so? I think we have to ask some existential questions, like, why are we doing this? Part of that cultivation is also, since I define it as submission to God, is cultivating, of course, a relationship with God that starts to grow over time, that's nurtured over time. And all of us in Christian leadership struggle, I think, like anybody else, to say, I want to make sure I have that time for prayer and for scripture reflection, for the meaningful, disciplines of the faith that can help me to thrive in my relationship with God. And that doesn't sound particularly earth shattering and such, but I can tell you, I spent a lot of times when I was younger as a pastor listening to the people who thought I, listening to people I thought I should listen to because they had big platforms and so forth, and all of that. And I know that's sort of counter to the whole, evangelical machinery. But my my thing is, look, it's like they say all politics is local. Like, all pastoral ministry is really local. And so rather than me trying to spend all my time modeling myself after somebody I don't even really know, but who's out in the media, I need to get to know my people. I need to get to know the context that I'm called to serve in, and to love those people, and to love the city and the context that I'm called. To me, that shows a posture of humility. I'm really willing to learn and be shaped, and to be um, um, malleable enough to work in wherever place God sends me, and not think, oh, my ultimate goal is I got to be the person who demands a big platform because, after all, I've got this great education, or I got all these things. I don't think that's the way we ought to move. Yet, I still will say the refrain that I mentioned earlier: God is anti the proud, and that's actually the Greek way of putting it. It's anti the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That ultimately there is a reward that God gives. It might not look like an earthly reward that we might crave, but there's an ultimate favor that God gives when we are willing to say, it's not the platform that I'm building, it's the faithfulness that I'm exhibiting.
Mm. We're nearing the end of our conversation with you. It's been so helpful. You do share one painful story in the book about being a failed church planter. I've been there. I know that story myself personally. And so, as you're talking to pastors and church leaders, and they're dealing with failure, set out to do something. I think you talk about how you were planting that church in Brooklyn, and it just didn't turn out the way that you were expecting. It taught you a lot about humility. Talk to the pastors and leaders listening. What is humility and failure? How do those two work together? And how can you redeem failure through humility?
Yeah. Well, I would like to think that church planting experience is not a failure. I think that's one. I think failure, I'm going to put that in a moral category. I'm going to put that in, if I cheated that church out of money or cheated my wife or something, I'm going to put failure in that category. I'm going to say that the church didn't take off. And there were so many factors in that were outside of my control. I'll own the things that I was not as skilled at least I try to. That list probably keeps growing. But I would say that when we don't achieve the things that we thought we would achieve, I'll put it that way, there's certainly a lot of pain that goes with that. I'm not going to minimize that at all. We aspired to something and we didn't get there. What I'm hoping is that if we can still come back to this notion that my my posture before God is fundamentally the most important thing, then hopefully that can give me a place to grow from and find some hope in. I mean, let's be real about this. We've got the most humble person, Jesus, right? Who we see in that beautiful Philippians hymn. It doesn't exploit his godliness, but what happens? He gets humiliated and gets killed. So would we call that failure? Of course not. The rest of the hymn says, God therefore super exalts him, hyper exalts him, and gives him a name above every name, right? So, but it looked like failure on one level, right? Certainly. So there's going to always be that for us. There's going to be this sense that we're doing something. It doesn't turn out the way we want. It's going to look like a failure, but ultimately it's about faithfulness.
We've been talking to Dr. Dennis Edwards. You can learn more about him at revdrdre.com. That's REVDRDRE.com. Be sure to check out his book, Humility Illuminated, The Biblical Path Back to Christian Character. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast and through our new podcast network, ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. See you on the next episode.